but I don't think we should be shaming. And one of the things that I so appreciated about the way that the Delta 5 presented themselves in their action and in the trial and in everything about their case was that they didn't try to shame anybody involved in this, and they invited the best out of everyone that they interacted with. One of my favorite pieces of evidence in this trial was the picture of Abby at the top of the tripod and the cherry picker coming over with the cops in it, and Abby reaching out with a clipboard and a petition on it, asking the cops and the firefighters to sign her petition to Governor Inslee for no new fossil fuel infrastructure. She was literally inviting them to be better than they were being. And that's also something that there was kind of a founding principle of the Climate Disobedience Center. The other folks that I started the Climate Disobedience Center with were all folks who were involved in the lobster boat blockade action, where Jay O'Hara and Ken Ward anchored a lobster boat in front of the Brayton Point coal-fired power plant and prevented a shipment of West Virginia coal from being delivered. And they were put on trial, and they were actually given permission to use the necessity defense, but they didn't get to do it because on the first day of their trial, the district attorney took over the prosecution of the case, dropped all the charges, and then came outside to the crowd that we had gathered and all the clergy and media and supporters and everything that we had out there and gave this big speech about how he was dropping the charges out of concern for all the children who would be impacted by climate change. And he said there's been a serious failure of political leadership on this that necessitates this kind of action. And this was a little before the big climate march in New York in 2014, and he held up Bill McKibben's Rolling Stone article, and he said, "I've been passing this around to all my staff, and I'm going to be marching in New York in a couple weeks." And and I was just standing there completely stunned that a district attorney would be doing this. As a Unitarian, I don't believe that any group of people is inherently bad. But there are some groups that I have to remind myself that that's what I believe. And towards the top of that list is criminal prosecutors in the age of mass incarceration. And so to have a prosecutor come out and join our side in that bold way when he was tasked with the job of being our opponent. Like structurally, he was supposed to be our opponent. He was supposed to be against us. And yet he came out and took this big step onto our side. And so I had to reflect on what it was that it would invite our supposed opponent to become our ally. And I think a big part of it was the way that Ken and Jay and everybody else associated with that action operated as they did it. Jay is a Quaker, and he talks a lot about his own call to conscience. And every time that he talked about taking that action, he talked about what he needed to do in order to be right with his own conscience. And so the battle lines that he drew with that action was a confrontation not between him and somebody else who's doing something bad. The battle lines that he drew was between himself and his own conscience, or between his actions and his conscience. And so I think he invited others into reflection on their own conscience and into reflection on what they needed to do to be right with their own conscience. And so he did this very bold, confrontational, uncompromising action that put pressure on those in power, but it was a kind of pressure that invited the best out of them at the same time, that might have challenged their structural role, but invited out the best of their humanity, invited their humanity to supersede their structural legal role. And that's, so we started Climate Disobedience Center with the intent that that's the kind of action that we wanted to create more of. That's the kind of perspective and principles that we wanted to guide more civil disobedience in this movement that invites the best out of people rather than shaming them.